It's my pleasure to welcome you to our convocation today. My name is Jim Symons, and we have a theme for our convocations this year. It's Living into Hope. And of course, we chose that theme because we are involved in so many crises in our country, to say the least, after the last 2 weeks. So Living into Hope is our theme. And on this day, we remember Martin Luther King. The holiday will be next Monday to celebrate his birth. And it's a good thing to think about Martin Luther King helping us live into hope over the last 60 years as we have considered the crisis of race in our country. And so today, the sponsors for our program is a new task force at Monte Vista Grove, a diversity task force that is lifting up the value of inclusion and focused on what blocks inclusion in these days, and that's systemic racism. And so we look to Martin Luther King as our source of inspiration. And when I think of systemic racism and Dr. King, I think of his letter from the Birmingham jail, in which he included these words: "Injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere. We are caught in an inescapable network of mutuality, tied in a single garment of destiny. Whatever affects one directly affects all indirectly." And so it is today. We will use this as the launching pad for our program. And the program over the next hour is going to include Jane Vásquez grounding us with prayer and scriptures. And then Dave Winters will raise the question what God is asking of us. What's the theological basis for this? Sandra Mader has a video that looks at systemic racism. And then Dean Thompson will talk about systemic racism in the church and here at Monte Vista Grove. Our chairperson of our task force, Lynn Cheyney, will talk a little bit about what the task force has done, and then introduce 20 minutes of breakout rooms, 5 breakout rooms, where everybody will get a chance to share their feelings and thoughts about systemic racism and deal with some of the possibilities here of dealing with that at Monte Vista Grove. After a 10-minute period of feedback from these groups, I will conclude the program. Now that's a lot in 1 hour, but here we go. Jane will begin us.
The scripture for today is from Isaiah 58, verses 6 to 12, and I'm using the translation that appears in the message. "This is the kind of feast day I'm after, to break the chains of injustice, get rid of exploitation in the workhouse, free the oppressed, cancel debts. What I'm interested in seeing you do is sharing your food with the hungry, inviting the homeless poor into your homes, putting clothes on the shivering ill-clad, being available to your families. Do this and the lights will turn on and your lives will turn around at once. Your righteousness will pave your way. The God of glory will secure your passage. Then when you pray, God will answer. You'll call out for help and I'll say, here I am. If you get rid of unfair practices, quit blaming victims, quit gossiping about other people's sins, if you are generous with the hungry and start giving yourselves to the down and out, your lives will begin to glow in the darkness. Your shadowed lives will be bathed in sunlight. I will always show you where to go. I'll give you a full life in the emptiest of places, firm muscles, strong bones. You'll be like a well-watered garden, a gurgling spring that never runs dry. You'll use the old rubble of past lives to build anew. Rebuild the foundations from out of your past. You'll be known as those who can fix anything, restore old ruins, rebuild and renovate, make the community livable again. And we'll have a short prayer for social justice. Grant, O God, that your holy and life-giving spirit may so move every human heart that the barriers which divide us may crumble, suspicion disappear, hatred cease, and that with our divisions healed, we might live in peace and justice. Through your Son, Jesus Christ our Lord. Amen. And Dave Winters is going to share a meditation on this.
Thank you, Jane. And it's good to see all of you, even as we're hiding out in our homes. Still, knowing most of you, this preaching to the choir is not normally a rewarding experience. And so I'll just try to remind us of what we all know and suggest that we know and may do more than we have imagined. We have so many powerful streams of stories and themes, of teachings that give life-changing charge to us in our preaching and teaching and our living out our understandings of being new persons in Jesus Christ. For me, the most important, the most life-giving and energizing themes are two. The first is the continuing call to remember who you are, remember who you were. You were slaves, and the living God of all things and all peoples heard your cries. This God claimed you and called you out of slavery. You were nobodies, and now you are somebodies. And this God of might and majesty has led you toward a new land, a land of milk and honey. Remember who you were. Remember who you are. And for me, the second is like unto that. It is this constant stream of care for the least, for the outsider. Welcome the stranger, for you were once strangers in the land. Care for the hungry, the thirsty, the sick, the widow, the orphan. Visit the imprisoned. Bring the homeless poor into your house. In my mind, those streams give life and flesh to the invitation to love God and neighbor as oneself. 2 years ago, Rachel and I wandered down to Alabama to retrace the steps of the march from Selma to Montgomery. It's now, believe it or not, a national historic trail, and who would have imagined that in 1965? But halfway between Selma and Montgomery, we saw a large National Park Service sign, and behind it was an impressive looking building identified as the Lowndes County Interpretation Center. It's a big building located on a site where the marchers camped out one of the nights on that trip. And inside, one of the large displays is an old Army surplus wall tent with a mattress and a few meager possessions carefully stowed inside. The display explains how, following the passage of the Voting Rights Act of 1965, more than 300 families of tenant farmers and sharecroppers who dared to register to vote were kicked off the land and struggled to survive in a field of old tents with no place to go and no resources to get them there. A sad and tragic unintended consequence of very well-intended actions. And maybe that's not too dissimilar to what James Marwick and David Gamble and others of that time saw more than 96 years ago, when they saw the circumstances of many men and women who had spent their lives in service of the church and its mission, And when they retired, they had no place to go and very few resources to get there. But our antecedent saints knew who they were and offered a vision and then a space of milk and honey, of orange trees and roses. So what about us? We who have preached and taught on these themes for so long can acknowledge that the vision is incomplete. We are not yet the community God invites us to become. As usual, the answers aren't easy. We are part of a large amorphous systems that are difficult to see, let alone change. Think of our proud Presbyterian call system, for example. It has served most of us pretty well, but like many other well-intentioned systems, our call system has not served all of us equally well. The church, too, is deeply infected with white male privilege when, for example, can you imagine did a Pasadena Pres or Knox or San Marino senior pastor search committee seriously consider calling an African American or Hispanic American or Asian American pastor? Almost invariably, our hyphenated pastors were called only to small, urban, seriously under-resourced congregations. Because of that system, our system, very few of those pastors were supported well enough to accumulate the resources that would enable them to come to this land of milk and honey, of palm trees and roses, of Brussels sprouts with cranberries. Thus, diversity is difficult. We have to pay the bills. We have talked about reparations, but that's a hard word, loaded with a great deal of emotional freight. I'm grateful that Jim Rice, editor of Sojourners magazine, in a somewhat related article this month, reminds me of the word mitigation. Part of the definition, he says, includes reducing the harmful effects of actions or systems. How do we mitigate the harmful effects of a call system and the attitudes that deprive some of our sisters and brothers of the safe, comfortable, desirable, earned retirements that both we and they would love to enjoy? There is no silver bullet. Perhaps foundations can be moved to support the heavy burden of entrance fees for some. Perhaps we can partner with the Board of Pensions in some kind of plan to assist much more significantly than they have in the past. Perhaps we who are able need to pay more so others might share in our milk and honey. Remember who you were. Remember who you are. Is not this the fast that I choose? To loose the bonds of injustice, to undo the thongs of the yoke. We've all preached, prayed, taught, thought about the new beloved community, the coming kingdom where there is neither Jew nor Greek, male nor female. We know all those words by heart, but our community does not yet look like that. We're older than we like to admit. Many are frail. We're comfortable here, walled off by our tall hedges, but dream with us. Dream of a strong community that knows who it was, a community that intentionally, creatively reaches out to many who have also labored long and hard, but may not look exactly or sound exactly like us, but in whose company we would be immensely enriched. We have right now, in the midst of death and deprivation, uncertainty and anxiety, the opportunity to move a bit closer to those beautiful images of God's kingdom here and now, the ones that have energized us for most of our lives. What does God require of us? A new vision, a power, and the strength to move toward that. Help us find the way. And now to Sandra Mader.
So what is an impediment to this beloved community? We're going to watch a video made in 2019 that brings to life the historical framework of the term systemic racism.
This is Jamal. Jamal is a boy who lives in a poor neighborhood. He has a friend named Kevin who lives in a wealthy neighborhood. All of Jamal's neighbors are African American and all of Kevin's neighbors are white. Because Jamal's school district is mostly funded by property taxes, his school is not very well funded. His classrooms are overcrowded, his teachers are underpaid, and he doesn't have access to high-quality tutors or extracurricular activities. Kevin's school district is also funded by property taxes, so his school is very well funded. His classrooms are never crowded, his teachers are very well paid, and he has access to high-quality tutors and lots of extracurricular activities. Kevin and Jamal live only a few streets away from each other. So how come they're growing up in such different worlds with such different opportunities for success? The answer has to do with America's history of systemic racism. To understand it better, let's look at what life was like for Kevin and Jamal's grandparents. Decades after the Civil War, many government agencies started to draw maps dividing cities into sections that were either desirable or undesirable for investment. This practice was called redlining, and it usually blocked off entire black neighborhoods from access to private and public investment. Banks and insurance companies used these maps for decades to deny black people loans and other services based purely on race. Historically speaking, owning a home and getting a college education is the easiest way for an American family to build wealth. But when Jamal's grandparents wanted to buy a house, the banks refused because they lived in a neighborhood that was redlined. So Jamal's grandparents were not able to buy a home, and because colleges could prevent them from attending through legal segregation, their options for higher education were really scarce. Kevin's grandparents, on the other hand, got a low-interest loan to buy their first house and got accepted into a handful of top universities, which traditionally only accepted white students. This opened up a wealth of opportunities that they were able to pass on to their kids and grandkids. Even as late as the 1980s, an investigation into the Atlanta real estate market showed that banks were more willing to lend to low-income white families than to middle or upper-income African-American families. As a result, today, for every $100 of wealth held by a white family, black families have $5.04. A 2017 study confirms that redlining is still affecting home values in major cities like Chicago today. This explains how Kevin and Jamal inherited vastly different circumstances. Unfortunately, the story doesn't end there. A big part of systemic racism is implicit bias. These are prejudices in society that people are not aware that they have. Let's go back to Kevin and Jamal. Against all odds, Jamal manages to be the only student from his high school to get accepted into a great university, the same one that Kevin and his high school friends are attending. But after Kevin and Jamal both graduate, Jamal notices that his resume isn't drawing as much interest as Kevin's, even though they graduated from the same program with the exact same GPA. Unfortunately for Jamal, studies show that resumes with white-sounding names get twice as many callbacks as identical resumes with black-sounding names. Implicit bias is one of the reasons why the black unemployment rate is twice the rate of white unemployment, even among college graduates today. You can see evidence of systemic racism in every area of life. The disparities in family wealth, incarceration rates, political representation, and education are all examples of systemic racism. Unfortunately, the biggest challenge with systemic racism is that there's no single person or entity responsible for it, which makes it very hard to solve. So what can you do? The first thing you can do is work towards becoming more aware of your own implicit biases. What are some prejudices that you might hold that you're not aware of? Second, let's acknowledge that the consequences of slavery and Jim Crow laws are still affecting access to opportunity today. As a result, we should support systemic changes that create more equal opportunities for everyone. Increasing public school funding and making it independent from property taxes would be a great start, so that poor and wealthy districts can receive equal access to resources. Systemic problems require systemic solutions. Luckily, we're all part of the system, which means that we all have a role to play in making it better. Peace.
Ponder the PCUSA and Monte Vista Grove Homes. Please ponder this observation from the Presbyterian Church USA. Our country's most important institutions have been built to sustain white privilege, to protect white lives and white property at the expense of our siblings of color. I suggest that partly because of our historical theological DNA, privileged white Presbyterians unknowingly participate in a vision of America where whiteness is valued above everything else. We must never forget that the two major systematic theologians of American Presbyterianism during the Civil War period were racists. Charles Hodge of Princeton Seminary owned slaves, and Robert Louis Dabney of Union Theological Seminary in Virginia was Stonewall Jackson's racially embittered chaplain. Please ponder this question asked recently by the Presbyterian historian of the Martin Luther King years, Taylor Branch. If people were given the choice between democracy and whiteness, how many would choose whiteness? Please ponder this prophetic statement by the LA Times columnist L.Z. Granderson. As a Black man, I am furious that the treatment of white domestic terrorists attacking American values tends to be far more humane than the treatment of the Black citizens trying to hold the country to those values. Today, our monumental challenge is to imagine and work for a vision of church and society that is not based on white privilege. Let me point to a few significant signs of hope. At the 2020 General Assembly of the PCUSA, commissioners voted overwhelmingly for the resolution called Responding to the Sin of Racism and a Call to Action. Admitting complicity in perpetuating injustice, the resolution challenged congregations and individual Presbyterians to use PCUSA policies already in place to confront injustice and racism in their own communities. The moderators of that General Assembly are a Native American woman and an African American male. I also want to point to the hope-filled fact that our surrounding presbyteries here in the Los Angeles Basin are among the most racially diverse in our entire denomination. This gives us a lot to work with as we confront systemic racism. Finally, I lift up a Monte Vista Grove Homes case study that could possibly lead to the holy work of repair. The McCormick Seminary ethicist, Reggie Williams, suggests that the regulating practice of white as normal has led us to historical depictions of Jesus and of God as white. A remarkable example of this practice can be seen in the exquisite sculpture of a white Jesus that beautifully adorns our major campus entrance. I love that sculpture, and I receive spiritual inspiration from the sculpture. However, this white Jesus is insufficient by itself. Therefore, I thank Lynn Cheyney for enabling us to live into a reparations paradigm by sharing multiple artistic depictions of Jesus on a prominent wall in our commons. I would love to go a step farther in this holy work of repair by commissioning a sculpture of a Black Madonna to grace another prominent section of our wondrous campus. Grove resident Mary Lee Robertson has imaginatively and hopefully challenged our Diversity Task Force to recommend a reparations fund to which people could make voluntary contributions. I hope we will support her pastoral and prophetic suggestion to create a reparations fund here at Monte Vista Grove Homes. And now, a word from Lynn Cheyney.
Thank you, Dean. It has been such a privilege to work on this diversity task force. I'm terribly excited about both what the distance we've traveled so far, as well as the journey ahead. And I want to share just a little bit about what we have been up to since we were formed. Actually, the impetus for the Diversity Task Force came out of the George Floyd murder back in May 2020. And after that, there were 10 volunteers who wanted to be a part of helping Monte Vista Grove live into this new, not new, I think it's been a part of our vision for a long time. We've just struggled to live into it in any real way. And so those 10 volunteers had their first meeting the end of July the 28th. And we were formed by the Resident Relations Committee of the board, and they charged us with 3 key issues to put our attention toward. First, that we would increase the diversity of the Monte Vista Grove board. Second, that we would increase the diversity of the resident population. And third, that we would assure equity in the Monte Vista Grove workforce. And so they asked us to identify barriers to achieving those goals and to research possible solutions. And so the Diversity Task Force met around that charge. And I think if there was one theme that kind of filtered through all of us, is we decided that our bumper sticker would be something along the lines of that the Grove will look different in 5 years. We wanted to boil it down and make it very simple. We want to look and be different 5 years from now. As well as we wrestled with the charge before us, we have really committed ourselves to a broad understanding of what it means to be inclusive, that inclusion includes Black and Brown, differently abled, LGBTQ, that any marginalized group in our Presbyterian system needs to have our attention and to feel that warm welcome from Monte Vista Grove. Our work has taken three different focuses over these last 5 months. And just like to share a few of those with you. The first has been for us, the work of education and reflection. Almost all of our meetings began with kind of a grounding quote that we reflected on and shared our reflections and comments, and all of those were very provocative. One that Dean just shared with you from the General Assembly. Our country's most important institutions have been built to sustain white privilege, to protect white lives and white property at the expense of our siblings of color. Well, that is quite a conversation provoker for 10 deeply interested and committed participants on the task force. And so we wrestled with that and our own participation in systemic racism. We wrestled with matters of reparations. One of the quotes that we struggled with, I will read this to you as well, as President Lyndon B. Johnson said in 1965, "You do not take a person who for years has been hobbled by chains and liberate him, bring him up to the starting line of a race, and then say, 'You are free to compete with all the others,' and still justly believe that you have been completely fair." Or as US Supreme Court Justice Harry Blackmun wrote in 1978, "In order to get beyond racism, we must first take account of race. There is no other way. And in order to treat some persons equally, we must treat them differently." So each of our meetings started with this time of reflection and self-understanding, and I think ultimately a sense of repentance, knowing that all of us carry those implicit biases, and we're not happy that we carry them, but wanting to be more aware of them and to work on our own souls, our own ways of being, so that we could diminish that those ways that are kind of embedded in us as well. So we would come to the end of each of those discussions with, I think, a sense of repentance and a commitment to effecting change in our community through our work together. The second focus of our work together has been information gathering. It meant that we needed to really understand the Monte Vista Grove entrance process. Most of us came a long time ago, and the processes have changed over the years, and we knew that we needed to understand just what it means to apply and find yourself here in our beloved community. And so part of that question was to try to identify the barriers to entry. And in particular, what are the barriers for those who are marginalized, those who are persons of color or other groups that are marginalized? We quickly came to understand that there were significant financial barriers that needed to be broken down. And so we've been in conversation with presbyteries and synods, and probably most importantly and most hopefully the Board of Pensions, trying to find ways that the larger church might assist us in making sure that we become a more diverse community. So we've checked into available assistance programs, and this work is still ongoing. We also have surveyed all of the presbyteries within the Synod of Southern California and Hawaii. And so each member of our task force was assigned a different presbytery, and conversations ensued. We wanted the names of those in their presbyteries who were retired or nearly retired, with a special focus on persons of color and other marginalized groups. Those will be used in an upcoming marketing campaign, because frankly our wait lists are short, and we need to begin to really get the word out to everyone about this amazing community. But our intention, sometime in this new year, pretty early on, our intention is to make very targeted invitations to persons of color and those in marginalized groups, so that we can begin to, again, make real that vision that in 5 years we will look different than we do today. The third piece of work that we have given significant attention to is to put into words our intention. And so together, over a matter of a number of meetings, we created a statement of intention that we hope will guide our efforts over the years to come. I'm going to read it for you, and I know we put it on the flyer, and I'm hoping that you'll be able to see it when we break into small groups in just a moment, but I want to read it for you. We, as you know, wordsmithing any statement by a group is its own challenge. But we came up with a statement that we are committed to, and we ultimately sent this statement of intention along to the Resident Relations Committee and to the board, our board. And the Monte Vista Grove Board approved this at their November meeting, and will begin now to include this statement of intention in our publicity. But the statement reads like this: Monte Vista Grove Homes strives to live out the Christian value of radical inclusivity, intentionally creating and nurturing a community of welcome that reflects the love of God and the rich diversity of the human family. We recognize that this is a huge task, but one that really enlivens us, and we trust enlivens our entire community. We have our work cut out for us, but we believe this work really matters, not only to those of us here, but that we won't really be a complete community until we more reflect the ethnic and cultural diversity of our larger church and our world. Now, we also recognize that none of this is possible without the entire community's buy-in and participation. So we hope that this is a beginning conversation, but you know that we'll be back in touch with you. But we do want to have an actual conversation today through this Zoom portal. We need your feedback and your assistance, and we want to hear from you today and moving forward as well. So today's process is that Lindsay is going to break us into 5 different groups. Each of those groups will be led by one of our Diversity Task Force members. There will also be a Diversity Task Force member who will be serving as scribe for each one of those groups. And we're going to take 20 minutes and you'll get a reminder, a notice when there's 1 minute left in our small group meetings, and then Lindsay will pull us back together for a brief time of reporting, and then Jim will offer our wrap up. Just a word of just note that for most of us, the screen sharing possibilities for this Zoom are new to us. So we hope that we're all able to share both the questions and the statement of intention with you, but please be forgiving if we have a few bobbles and bumbles in our process as we move into our small groups. So Lindsay, I will turn it over to you, and hopefully all of you, everyone here will end up in a small group in a short order. Thank you. I think we should all be back from our small group experiences. It was clear that we needed another hour just to be having this conversation. So many stories to be shared that were really quite poignant in our group, and I would imagine that they were in yours as well. I think that part of our current reality is that we're all on a learning curve. We're all figuring out where we've been in this story and where it is that we need to go. Our group, I won't share any of those poignant stories, but in terms of reflections on the statement of intention, there's a lot of positive feedback that they liked the intentionality of it, but also recognized that it was not going to happen overnight, that this was going to be a long process. And everyone is going to be needed to be on board with this before we can begin to make progress. Statements that the statement was bold, it was inclusive, it's logical, it's exciting, it gives us something to aim for, but also the recognition that implementation is going to be the next challenge, and your diversity task force, and I trust the whole community, is going to be up for that. Also, just a couple of comments about how we do need to hear the stories of those who are already here and what that may be in marginalized groups. What was their experience like? How can we be a more welcoming community? So that was a helpful thing for us to be thinking about as well, that we do have people from marginalized groups and we need to learn from them about how we might proceed in the future. So I will turn it over to Jane Vásquez, who is reporting for her group.
To reiterate what you were saying, Lynn, but one of the things that we came down to is the question of economics, because economics underlie it. And most people of color in the church have served in low-income positions and maybe not even very many years with the Board of Pensions, maybe in another situation where they were working for the church, but their congregation could not afford the dues to pay into. So we talked about economics, and one suggestion was that families in the health center are often quite grateful for the care that their loved ones get. And there are people among those families who could serve on our board and who could also make a gift, a financial gift. And I know from the Christmas gift that we give to our staff, a large percentage of that comes from families who have someone in the health center. So they have two resources as their possibility to give and also possibility to serve on the board.
Great. Let me turn it then over to Norm for a quick report.
Our group had really two themes. One was thinking through the beloved community, and the other was that this is going to involve making sacrifices. And these ran through our responses to all three questions. For example, these are things that we noted. It's not easy to be that beloved community. It takes many sacrifices. Many PCUSA congregations are uncomfortable with this. When we make sacrifices, we become open to criticism. We can be grateful for those that confront us. To have uncomfortable conversations may be healing and revealing. So those are some of the comments that we had.
Wonderful, thank you. And our scribes will be sharing and keeping all of these notes, and the Diversity Task Force will be reflecting on them at our next meeting as well. Debbie, would you report for your group, please?
Certainly. We spent most of our time sharing personal stories, and there was a definite trend in them, and I would say it's self-realization. Many shared stories of when they were younger and things they didn't realize they picked up from their childhood. And then the journey of self-realization, and even now as senior adults, still working on some of those things. There was one person who shared that just the other day she heard someone say, "I've been working like a slave." And she thought to herself, well, that person doesn't know about this. We just had gotten started on number 2, and the only comment we had was that clearly this was something to which we could hopefully ascribe to. However, they didn't think it was direct enough, too subtle. Religious language needs to be strengthened to have a sense of, and my words, urgency or importance. And that concludes our remarks.
Great, well, we will take that up at our next meeting. Perfect, thank you. And I'll finally turn it over to Jim Symons to report on his group and to close out our convocation.
We spent most of the time in our group talking about our own personal experiences. One person, for example, talked about having a good friend who was an African-American nurse, and she inadvertently said, when talking about her father, well, he worked like a nigger. And as soon as she said it, she was horrified. And this African-American nurse was very understanding and supportive of her. But it's the kind of thing that she recalls and feels terrible about that. So a number of other things along those lines, talking about our past. We had one a man, immigrant from the Philippines I think about 20 years ago. And he's felt very positive about entering into the American dream, grateful for education. And he has not experienced racism himself. And so he's positive about that. At the very end, we talked a little bit about what is required of us. We said education, awareness, outreach, and build and include more diversity. Several people said they really appreciate the effort that's being made by the Diversity Task Force and this program today. So I want to thank all of the scribes and the leaders for these small groups and the experience we had to chance to share with each other, and to repeat what Lynn has said, that our committee will seriously look at these notes with the ideas that we've received, and we're deeply appreciative of the participation of everybody in this program today. While offering thanks, I also want to say that there's two people who have made this happen today. One is Lindsay Mansis. Lindsay, we're so appreciative of you for doing this very technically difficult program, and you are a sweetheart. We really appreciate that. And the other person is Lynn Cheyney, who's pulled a very complex program together. And Lynn, we appreciate your ongoing leadership with our committee. Now, there's 3 steps that we want to take here at the end of this program. One is that our task force really feels like we are doing God's work. We are following Jesus in these efforts to deal with systemic racism and to make change. So we appreciate your ongoing prayers for our committee and for the work that is taking place and includes everybody in Monte Vista Grove. And of course, we have people from outside of Monte Vista Grove, so it's something that we can encourage each other, not just here, but have one person from Eugene, Oregon in our group. And so we want to ask you to keep this diversity task force in your prayers. Second thing is, we request that each Monte Vista Grove household give us the names of 3 potential residents, at least one of which would be a person or household or other marginalized community. We want to get these names by February 1st. So please get them to Nancy Lane, and you can see on the screen, it's nlane@mvgh.org by February 1st. And the third thing is keep imagining. I like this idea that we're trying to imagine new possibilities, that we can make progress toward the beloved community that we dream about. And any suggestion to Sandra Mader, and her address is on the screen too, sandra.mader07@gmail.com.
Jim, might I say we will include this in a Monday Minders so that you can have the next steps in front of you in print.
Great. Yes. So let me conclude by saying that we're grateful to everybody who's participated today. I want to make an announcement about next week. Michael Harrington will be our speaker. He's a researcher on brain research, particularly the aging brain, particularly on dementia and Alzheimer's, has a very large research building actually here in Pasadena. And all of us have aging brains, so we can identify with what he's doing. And he will be here to talk with us at that time. I want to conclude with one last image. This is Martin Luther King Day celebration. And I remember the importance of his last speech. He's in Memphis. He's there with justice for garbage workers. And it's the night that he died, he was killed. And in his speech that night, he said these words, "I have been to the mountaintop. I've looked over the other side. I've seen the promised land. Now, I may not get there with you, but I want you to know tonight that I'm not worried about a thing, because we as a people will get to the promised land. Mine eyes have seen the glory of the coming of the Lord." What does he mean when he says we as a people will get to the promised land? Well, it's obvious, it's so clear that everything Martin Luther King did was to oppose segregation and separation and to stand up for integration, bringing people together who would not usually be brought together, black and white together, rich and poor, young and old, male and female. He talked about Protestants and Catholics, Christians and Jews. His whole effort was to integrate people into this community that he said, the community that would get to the promised land. We are trying to be that community. And my prayer is that we will continue with all of our efforts to be that community that Martin Luther King talked about, the community that gets us to the promised land. Thank you so much for participating in our program today.